Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. This past month, we've been in a series called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. We've talked about characteristics of emotional maturity, and we've talked about traits of emotional immaturity. We've talked about emotional loneliness and the importance of creating space for a healthy expression of anger. And last week, we also explored 4 types of emotionally immature parents by psychologist Lindsay Gibson. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, this series might feel offensive. Maybe a little jarring. Engaging in this topic at all might feel like you're betraying your parents. But the goal here isn't disrespect or betrayal, but to see our childhoods objectively so that we can step into the truth of our stories more fully. And if you think about it, truth is such an important part of who God is. God is always speaking the truth in love, and the story of the Bible tells us the truth of our brokenness with unflinching honesty. And what does this do? This testimony honors our humanity and invites us to become who we were made to be. The last few episodes have focused primarily on parents, specifically creating space for a greater understanding and awareness of our childhoods. This process of looking back and naming is the first step, and it's such an important step. It helps us make sense of our stories and make valuable connections to why we think, feel, and act the way that we do today. It also helps us cultivate greater compassion for ourselves and others. In the last few episodes of this series, our focus will be on adult children. In other words, how do adult children move forward? How do they break dysfunctional patterns in their own lives? And how do they participate with God and His transformative work in their stories? In this episode, we're going to talk about how emotionally immature parenting can impact the heart and mind of a child, not only back then, but now. And we're going to do this by talking about how early childhood memories can shape some of the core beliefs that we are still living out of today. So as we move into today's episode, I want to invite you to think about you as a child. Perhaps a time in early childhood when you still held playful innocence or a sense of unshaken confidence. Maybe a time when you still had a wild, unrestrained imagination. Do you have a picture of that little girl or boy in your mind? What characteristics of that child come up for you? Especially when we're young, we often automatically reflect something of the goodness and beauty of God. That's how we're born. We come into the world with a natural desire to bring life, to connect with our parents, and to connect to the world in a way that we were meant to be. But what's also true is that we're born into families that have spent a lot of time on this earth and that have been shattered. And sometimes the goodness of a child is difficult for a family to bear. The nature of a child is that they are deeply impressionable to the words of their mother and father. And oftentimes, many of us learn very quickly through both explicit and implicit messages by people important to us that we must change who we are to connect, to stay safe, and to protect ourselves from pain. Let's go deeper into this. We all experience pain. No one is exempt. As children, few of us know what to do. In the first few years of life, how do you process the moment when your safety is stripped from you? How do you process when the person who is supposed to shield you from harm hurts you? How do you process the pain of loving someone that you never knew or will never see again? And how do you process scarring, soul-shaping words when you haven't yet learned what's true? From the time we enter this world, we begin crafting a story that helps us make sense and give meaning to the painful things that happen to us. And we can't underestimate the perceptiveness of children. As we developed, we all absorbed explicit and implicit messages from family members, authority figures, and peers about who we were and what the world expected of us. And over time, we gradually began to create a story about our identity and value based on these experiences, unconscious messages, and reactions of others, a narrative that grooves itself deeply into our hearts. This story helped us as children know what we needed to be and what we needed to do to stay safe in the world. It explained our lives to us. And over time, we began to build our lives around this story. This story often originates from the belief that the only way to be noticed, to stay safe, or to keep connection is to become something other than who we really are. Slowly, this story replaces the spontaneous expression of our true self, the self that we were made to be. Our innate aptitudes and genuine feelings often take a back seat to what seems to be necessary to survive or to secure a place in the family. This story was incredibly adaptive as children. It often helped us get through painful upbringings. But this story is a child's solution or interpretation that comes from a child's mind, so it often doesn't fit into adult realities. And so many of us are still, oftentimes unconsciously, living out of our childhood story. A story that helped us in childhood, but that is a broken story when lived out in adulthood. That's why it's so important to get to know that childhood story. This is where transformation begins, with seeing where our old story began and to exhume the hurtful events, the unchallenged, taken for granted beliefs, and unhelpful internalized messages from our childhoods that still rule our lives today. I want to get really specific here and talk about some first steps for actually going back and getting to know our childhood stories, and also how to begin connecting concrete memories to the formation of core beliefs. But first, it's so important that we don't miss the role of evil in this whole process. If you think about it, what is the enemy's intention for all of us? One primary intention is to keep us from knowing ourselves as loved by God. This can be an uncomfortable thought if we've never considered it. It's one thing to talk about the serpent in the garden, and it's another to acknowledge that evil has played and is playing an active role in our lives today, working to hijack our stories and prevent us from reflecting the love and beauty of God. In Revelation 12:9-10, the Bible calls the serpent a deceiver and accuser. It's so important to understand that evil doesn't wait to lie to us until we're old enough to defend ourselves. Rather, it assaults children, jumping on any opportunity to lie to us about who we are and the world around us. As we make meaning of our experiences, all of us accept and agree with some of these lies that feel like truth. Psychologist Dan Allender describes these experiences as agreements. He explains agreements as places in our stories where, consciously or not, we have believed the lies of evil. These lies can be thoughts or conclusions that enter our minds in the midst of painful circumstances. They can manifest as physical reactions to a person or situation, or sometimes people close to us use labels to name us in ways that distort, take away, or mar who we truly are. Believing or internalizing harmful comments that others make in vulnerable moments is another way that agreements can come to be. These comments can be long-term, severe verbiage around how stupid or naive we are, or they can be more subtle, such as, "Oh, stop being such a drama queen." I'm going to read a list of common agreements, and as you listen, notice if any seem to connect with you or your inner experience. I'm alone. No one will come for me. I am too sensitive. I am the only one who can rescue or protect my family. I will only be loved if I am perfect. I have to be tough. My body is dangerous to myself or others. Being in a relationship requires giving up myself. When I am good at something, I take something away from others. Being myself causes pain for me. Whenever I am good at something, I get hurt. I can't trust my own heart. My desires get me in trouble. I can never change. Do any of these agreements connect with you? Let me give you an example of how an agreement like this might form. Let's say that a middle school girl had a really hard day at school. 2 of her friends turned on her and began spreading rumors about her that weren't true. She's humiliated and completely devastated. When she gets home from school that day, her head is low and her shoulders are hunched. Her mom doesn't engage her or ask what's wrong. The little girl spends most of the afternoon in her room, and as her tears begin to fall that night at bedtime, she takes the risk of telling her mom what happened. And her mom turns to her, and without a moment of hesitation, says with a tone of annoyance, "You're being so dramatic. This is not a big deal. Just find some other friends." What is happening here? This mother probably doesn't have the capacity to hold a lot of space for her own tenderness and her own pain. Do you see the intergenerational pattern of brokenness here? In this moment, 2 things are happening. In one sense, she's trying to protect her daughter by hardening her up and getting her ready for the reality of an unforgiving world. And in another sense, she's actually not able to hold space for her daughter's tender heart and pain. So what happens inside of this little girl as she's lying awake in her bed that night? She feels silly. She feels ashamed. And in this moment of vulnerability, what conclusion does she come to? What story does she begin to tell herself about who she is and how the world works? I can imagine it would sound something like this. I will never be dramatic again. This would be an example of what Dan Allender calls a vow. What is a vow? Vows often follow agreements and happen when we pledge ourselves to a particular way of being based on an agreement to protect ourselves from getting hurt again. As with agreements, the vows we make in the midst of pain or high emotion are typically unconscious. However, we can recognize them in our stories by identifying explicit or implicit statements, beginning with words like, "I will never again," or "I will always," that tend to be broad sweeping and black and white. Vows provide temporary relief from pain by helping us regain some sense of control. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, they are incredibly adaptive and survival-based. But they come at a devastating cost and never bring true safety, rest, and authenticity. Here are some examples of common vows. Once again, notice if any seem to connect with you or your inner experience. I will never need anything that I cannot provide for myself. I will never let anyone get that close to me again. I won't let things affect me like this again. I will always be good and not make mistakes. I won't cause any drama. I will do what it takes to keep the peace. I will stay quiet and on the sidelines. I will not allow my beauty to show. I will give whatever it takes to please, protect, or rescue someone. So what happened to this little girl and the vow she made on her bed that night? She began to live it out. This memory shaped a core belief that sunk deep into this little girl's heart. It's no wonder that she became an adult who is disconnected from her own heart and emotions, who has retreated into the logic of her mind and has difficulty with emotional intimacy and vulnerability in relationships. So as you listen to this episode, did any agreement seem to put words to something inside of you? What about the list of common vows? When talking about the stories that we create as children, therapist and Episcopalian priest Ian Morgan Cron emphasizes that what supports us in childhood thwarts us in adulthood. Our old stories continue to operate autonomously in the shadows of the heart and become the enemy of our growth. The underlying premise to our old childhood stories run in direct opposition to the larger story of grace that God invites us to enter into. Does God invalidate our feelings and pain? Does God require us to be perfect in order to be accepted? Does God insist that we run ourselves into the ground with exhaustion before we can know peace? Does God require us to be something other than who we really are to belong? No, He doesn't. But until we become aware of our core beliefs and ways of being and participate with God in changing the narrative, we will continue to see ourselves, others, and the world through the lens of this old story, no matter how old we are or how different our lives may be now from the training ground of our childhood. So to wrap up this episode, I just want to invite you to reflect on any memories or beliefs that may have come up for you as you've listened to this episode. I'll be sharing some more of my thoughts as well as additional resources in this week's Substack, which is an email that I send out every Wednesday. If you'd like to receive this email, be sure to subscribe through the link in the show notes. But as you reflect on these beliefs and memories, I want to invite you to speak them out loud. Tell them to a trusted friend, or even write them in a journal. So much healing can happen as we invite a compassionate witness into this process of naming, whether it be the Holy Spirit or someone in our community who can hold this space with us. I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.